Welcome back to our Introduction to Biblical Poetry. We are relying on Leland Ryken's book, Sweeter Than Honey, Richer Than Gold, as our guide. We've already looked at some of the reasons that we find poetry intimidating. What we want to do now is look at the primacy of image in poetry. And the basic idea is simply that poets think and speak in the language of images. And so to interpret poetry well, the foremost thing we have to do is understand imagery and know how to make sense of it. Poetry versus poems. Before we can explore poems, we need to understand poetry. Poetry is the stuff, the material that we use to make poems. So when we understand how poetry works, we can then understand how poems are put together using poetry. So poetry is a language of images. It's a language of images. What do we mean by that? Well, let's do some definitions first. An image is a word that names a concrete action or object. Think of a word like running. You can picture running, can't you? You can see someone running. So that's an image because you can picture it, you can visualize it. Love, probably not so easy to visualize. Purity as well. But shepherd, you can visualize. So an image is a word that names a concrete action or object. What then is imagery? Well, imagery is the totality of images in a poem. When we think of Psalm 23, the dominant imagery is the imagery of a shepherd and his sheep. So that's the imagery. But a single image is a word that names a concrete action or noun, object. The primary unit of poetry is imagery. What do we mean by that? We mean the building blocks by which poets communicate their ideas is through images that they put together. They're not speaking about the images, but they're using the images to speak about something else. For instance, if you think of the book of Psalms, what's it about? It's about worship, it's about prayer, it's about goodness and righteousness and purity and faith in God in the midst of trials. So that's what it's about. But how do the psalmists speak about those things? Well, frequently they speak using words that name concrete pictures. So instead of speaking about providence, they speak about God is our shepherd. They speak about things like lions and wolves and beds and sloths and so on. So the pictures are talking about something else, aren't they? And Psalm 23 is a great example. What is Psalm 23 talking about? Obviously, it's talking about God, and more specifically, God's providence as he cares for his people. Psalm 23 is not about shepherds or shepherding. It's about God. But the picture of what shepherds do in caring for their sheep is used in order to communicate what God does in caring for his people. So poetry, friends, is a language of images. It relies on what Ryken calls the principle of indirection. The principle of indirection. Big word. Basically, Ryken says that poetry is based on this principle of indirection. What he means is that the poet uses the language of imagery to speak about something else. So the poet is saying one thing, but meaning something completely different. They're related, but he's not talking about the thing he's talking about. Now, I know that sounds confusing, so let's again bring it back to Psalm 23. The psalmist says, "The Lord is my shepherd." That is literally not true, right? So I'm not a sheep, and the Lord is literally not my shepherd. That's the principle of indirection. The image of a shepherd is used to picture how God treats us as his people. So the indirection is that he's speaking about one thing and saying one thing, but meaning another thing. And the key to interpreting poetry is to rightly recognize how these fit together and how the image maps onto or speaks to the actual thing that the poet is saying. So the principle of indirection. Now, what do images require of us? They require a few things if we are to interpret them well. First and foremost, we need to experience the image as vividly as we can. So the image paints a picture of something concrete. And the more we can visualize, picture the scene, the more impactful that image becomes. So we need to try to experience the images. Imagine we could taste and smell and see and feel and hear as the image is painted using words. Then three other things which we will unpack in some more detail. We need to identify the connotations of the image. We're going to talk about each of these, so I won't unpack them on this slide. Then we need to name the emotions that the image evokes. And lastly, we need to explore the logic of the image in the poem. Let's have a look at each of those in a little more detail. Firstly, the connotations of images. Words are said to have denotative and connotative meaning. The denotative meaning is the basic meaning of a word. The connotative meaning is the sort of feelings and things that we associate with that word. Sometimes they're very positive, sometimes they're very negative, and sometimes they're just neutral. Take these two words, home and house. If you're a native English speaker, these words mean the same thing, but they actually feel very different, don't they? So a home and a house, both of them, their denotation is a place where people live. But a house is simply that. It's just a building. It's neutral in terms of feeling communicated. A home, however, we have a saying in English that says, home is where the heart is. A home is a place where you are at home. You're amongst people who love you. It's a soft place to fall. So home has very warm, family-related connotations. So a house and a home, although superficially they both talk about a place where we can live, they actually have different feelings. This is what connotative meaning implies. When we read poetic images, we need to understand whether they're implying positive, negative, or neutral feelings about the thing they're talking about. Another example, president versus politician. For most English speakers, the word politician has a negative connotation. We think of politicians as people who make empty promises, as people who manipulate emotions in elections to get their way, whereas president often has positive connotations. Someone's presidential, it means that they carry themselves well and professionally. So a president generally is also a politician, and yet the two words have different feelings attached to them. So when we're interpreting poetry, we need to pay attention to the connotations behind the images. Are they positive, negative, or neutral? And what are they? What kind of additional layers of meaning through connotation are being implied? Next, we need to think about the emotions that are invoked. So images trigger emotions much more effectively generally than abstract words. And so when poets use images, they are invoking emotions. They awaken emotions in us. Therefore, when we interpret images, we need to be able to name the emotions that are provoked or sparked or evoked by the imagery. Take this excerpt from Psalm 59, verse 14. The psalmist says, each evening, it's David talking about his enemies. And he says, each evening they come back howling like dogs and prowling about the city. So he's picturing his enemies as hungry, ravenous dogs that are howling and prowling. Now try to picture that scene. What feelings does it evoke? Maybe disgust, maybe fear. So the imagery evokes emotion, and part of interpreting what the image is saying to us is being able to name the emotions that they're evoking. Lastly, we should think of the logic of images. So exploring the logical connection between the image used and the subject of the poem lies at the heart of this. And the question we're trying to ask is, why this image in this poem? So why is David using the imagery of howling, prowling dogs in Psalm 59? Why is the psalmist using the imagery of a shepherd and caring for sheep in Psalm 23? Why this image for this poem? That's trying to unpack the logic. And so we explore the logic for the choice of certain images and why the poet is using them to depict his emotions and try to communicate them to us. So the logic of images. So friends, in conclusion, poets think and speak in images. Poetry is the language of images. Therefore, interpreting poems requires experiencing the images, being able to enter into them and in a sense, place ourselves within the scene. And as we do that, we need to be considering the connotations of the images, the emotions that they invoke, and the logic. Why is he using this image in this place? What's he trying to communicate through it? So the primacy of image in poetry. I hope that's helpful.